Welcome. Today, we will begin by doing the evolution silent solo bell ringer. You might be watching this video because you were not present for class, or you might be watching this video to finish what we did not finish in class, or you may be watching this video to review on this topic today. Anywho, make sure by now you have submitted your evolution silent solo bell ringer that is on Google Classroom. After you've done that, we will go ahead and go on to evolution notes. So please do open that up on your own computer so you can follow along and create your own notes, which you will submit at the end of this lesson. Let's get started. Today's lesson is on evidence of common ancestry or evolution. We will call this lesson in class evolution. There are 3 out of 32 problems on the ACP, that's from this unit. It's going to be a larger unit, so strap in and make sure you have your concentration hat on so we can go through a lot of content, which I am very excited to share with you. Let's start with what we will be learning today. Our learning goal is I am learning about how different organisms develop, the bones or anatomy in different organisms, how molecules are used in different organisms, and I'm learning about diagrams that show evolutionary relationships, as well as fossil evidence for evolution. To be able to succeed in today's lesson, you will be able to identify developmental similarities, which is also called homology. I can identify anatomical homology. I can identify molecular homology. I can identify evolutionary relationships in a diagram. And lastly, I can identify gradualism, stasis, and punctuated equilibrium in fossil. So by the end of this lesson, you will be able to do all of those things under the success criteria. You will demonstrate your learning by completing guided practice, independent practice, and the DOL quiz. Our agenda today will be silent solo, which you've already done, and guided practice, independent practice, lastly, the DOL quiz. There are some terms that's new for this unit. Let's go over the glossary. Common ancestry means you share the same ancestor. Biogeography is the study of why organisms live where they live. Homology means similarity. Anatomical means having to do with bones. Molecular, having to do with molecules. In this lesson, we will focus on amino acid and nucleic acid. Developmental means having to do with how organisms develop. Stasis is a period of little to no change. Gradualism is a period that's with consistent and slow change. And punctuated equilibrium is stasis mixed with periods of a lot of change. There's one common misconception we will definitely address today, which is the idea that humans evolved from monkeys. There's a lot of vocabulary for this lesson, so let's talk about these words. Evolution, ancestral, common ancestor, descended, homology, developmental homology, anatomical homology, vertebral column, molecular homology, amino acid sequence, DNA sequence, relatedness, phylogenetic, phylogram, dendrogram, cladogram, spindle diagram, transitional fossil, stasis, taxonomy, species, interbreed, genus, taxon, taxa, biogeography, and lastly, zoogeographic region. Let's use these words in a sentence. Evolution is change of organisms over time. All living organisms today are birthed by their parents, who are considered their ancestors. All organisms are related because we are all descended from common ancestor. Evidence of common ancestry includes similarities that organisms share, which is called homology. There are 3 types of homology. First, similarity in how organisms develop in embryo is called developmental homology. Similarity in bone structure between organisms is called anatomical homology. For example, all animals with a spine is called a vertebrate and share a similar vertebral column. Similarity in amino acid sequence or DNA sequence is called molecular homology. The more similar two organisms are, the more related they are to each other. It also means they share a more recent common ancestor. There are four types of diagram that show relatedness. They are first, cladogram, dendrogram, spindle diagrams, phylogenetic diagrams, which is also called phylograms. Fossils are dead organisms, and they show that dead organisms from a long time ago underwent change over generations and transitioned into the organisms that we see in the world today. Transitional fossils show this change. There are also periods of time when little change occurred in the fossil record, which is called stasis. Taxonomy is the classification of organisms. Classification means organizing organisms into groups. There are different levels of classification. Another word for a level of classification is taxon, when we're talking about one level, or taxa for plural, more than one. One type of taxon is called species. Species include all the individuals that can mate and reproduce with each other. In other words, species are individuals who can interbreed. Another taxon is genus. Genus is one level of classification above species. In other words, genus is made up of species. Lastly, biogeography is the study of where organisms live. This world can be broken up into different regions based on the type of organisms found in that region. Each region is called a zoogeographic region. Here you're looking at a picture of early embryos. Which one is the embryo of a human? Which one do you think? They all look pretty similar. In fact, the one on the right is the embryo that develops into a human, and all the other ones develop into a fish, salamander, tortoise, or chicken. But notice how they look very similar when they are all early embryos. So, because they're similar, we say that embryos of fish, human, and chicken, we all show similar developmental homologies. We're looking at developmental homologies. It's interesting because like fish, birds, and lizards, our embryos have tails and gill slits. Human embryos have tails and gill slits. What are gill slits? These are gill slits on the sides of a shark. So when we were an embryo, we had those. Because we develop as embryos, these similarities are called developmental homologies. Human embryos share similarities with bird embryo, reptile embryo, and fish embryo. These organisms all develop similarly because we share a common ancestor. Let's practice. First, underline the question. In this case, it's a set of instructions. The fact that both of these mammals incubate their premature offspring provide evidence that they, and you are to complete that sentence. Let's highlight some keywords that we've been looking at, including words we've heard today. Development is a word we heard over and over again, so let's highlight the word development. Next, what do we know about this word development? We know that organisms who develop similarly, that is because they share a common ancestor. We know these two mammals are not in the same species. We know that they don't have similar bones. We don't really know that, right? You can't really see through their skin to know exactly how their bones look. So we don't really know about their skeletal structures. We can take out that they must travel great distances to eat. We are given no information about their traveling to consume food. And consistent with our annotation box, we know that these two animals develop similarly because they descend from a common ancestor. Quick note, make sure you are completing these notes so that you may turn them in at the end of this lesson. So please do follow along. Underline the question. The fact that both of these mammals incubate their immature offspring in pouch provides evidence that they, That's the question. That's the instruction. We have to finish that sentence. We see this phrase, incubate their immature offspring in a pouch. That's when they put their babies inside of their tummy to allow them to develop. So what do we remember about this word, develop? We remember that organisms develop similarly because they share a common ancestor. So we know they're not the same species. They cannot mate and create viable offspring, so they are not in the same species. We don't really know much about their diet and how they get their food. We also can't see through their skin to see their bones, so we don't really know about their skeletal structures. But we do know that because they develop similarly, they are descended from a common ancestor. You're looking at an image of many bones, and in fact, all of these different skeletal structures have a backbone. That is your spine, that is your back. So some of these are fish, reptile, birds, humans, and non-human mammals. Spine is also called the vertebral column. They can be found in the fossils. In fact, you're looking at a picture of these fossils right now. We call animals with the spine vertebrate. Vertebrates have similar vertebral column, that spine structure, which is a type of anatomical homology. Remember, homology means similarity. Anatomical means bones. Let's look at another set of bones. Here, we're looking at the bones of human, a horse, a dolphin, and a bat. We know different organisms, even though we're different, they are structured in a similar way. We're looking at them. Look at how similar they are in structure. Compare the colors and see how they're present in each one of these 5 organisms. This similarity is what we would call anatomical homology. How could this similarity, this anatomical homology in mammals have evolved? Again, that is because of common ancestry. So you might have noticed we're using this word homology. So we're not going to use the word similarity as much. We're going to now use this new vocabulary word we are learning and becoming familiar with. So we're going to speak like a biologist and say homology when we are thinking of similarity. One more question for now. Underline the instruction. Here, it's to complete the sentence. What words do we see that we have been talking about from this lesson? Common ancestry. We also see this image that basically is what we saw before, right? All these bones. We know because we're talking about bones, we will remember that different organisms can have similar bone structures. So we know that they don't provide the same function, so we can take that out because a bat uses those bones to fly. But a human uses an arm to grab things, so they perform a different function. They're not the same size, right? The bones of a cat are much smaller than the bones of an adult human, so we can take out size. We actually know that these bones look like they have similar basic structure, so the right answer is F. Again, underline the question. Which words have we seen in this lesson? We've been hearing about bones, so let's highlight the word bones. What about bones? Bones are anatomical. When they're similar in their structure, we call that anatomical homology. So we see that similarity in this photo. And anatomical homology evolved because of common ancestor. Now, let's see which incorrect words are there. We don't really know where these animals lived. We also don't know if they can interbreed or mate and then have offspring, right? We're just looking at bones. There's nothing suggesting that they can reproduce necessarily. We also don't know what they kind of ate just by looking at their bones, kind of actually in their legs, right? So again, looking at our annotation box, anatomical homology, similar bones, is due to common ancestor. So these primates shared a common ancestor. Underline the question. We have a question mark that makes this much easier for us. Now we are going to highlight the words we've been hearing today. Fossils. We've been talking about fossils. And also ancestor. We know we're looking at bones. So whenever we're looking at bones, we have to be thinking about the word anatomical. They're similar. If we look at these three bones, we see similarity. There's a vertebral column in all three of these fossils, and we also see rear legs, right? So this anatomical homology evolved because of common ancestry. Let's see what incorrect words we can take out. Nitrogenous bases, that's part of a DNA, right? We can't see their DNA from this image. We actually don't know where they were found, these fossils. And we actually see that there is a smaller fossil in the middle. So that's not the oldest or the youngest. So that makes D incorrect. According to our annotation box, homologous structures is found in each fossil. We see that similarity. Now, we're going to look at three organisms, mushroom, slug, and sea lion, like we've done in class before. They all have adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. They have the same four nucleotides. They're different organisms, but they use the same four letters, A, C, G, and T, in building their DNA. Because adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine are molecules, the use of the same four molecules in DNA sequence between different organisms, we call this molecular homology. Quick review. Cells. Zoom into a cell, you find a DNA. DNA have different letters. Each one of these letters is a nucleotide. One nucleotide is made up of three parts: phosphate, sugar, and base. The base can be any one of these four: adenine, guanine, cytosine, or thymine, which allows you to end up with four types of nucleotide. So that's what I just said up there. And we also know that DNA is made up of phosphate, sugar, and nitrogen base. There's four nitrogen bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. Another quick review. There are three types of homology that supports common ancestry. If we develop similarly, we call that developmental homology. If we have similar bones, we call that anatomical homology, and that can be seen in fossils. If we have similar DNA sequence or amino acid sequence, we call that molecular homology. Homo means same or similar. So to investigate how one species branch off or become different from another species, scientists use these three homologies. Let's practice. Let's put underline under the question. So we have a question mark. We can identify the question. Now, we heard the word branch off. To investigate how organisms branched off, scientists use something called homologies. Three types of homology: developmental, anatomical, and molecular. Now, we're not thinking about food web, how different organisms eat. We're also not really informed about how they move, specifically how they went from one place to another, migration. So we can take out those words. We also know we're not really talking about interaction between species. We're talking about these three homologies that have to do with how we develop, how our bones look, and the DNA and amino acid sequence, which is molecular. So we can talk about anatomical, which is fossil, and we can talk about DNA comparisons because that is molecular. Now let's underline the instructions. Again, we are expected here to finish the sentence. The physical features of animals in this family and the family's geographical region provide evidence that all these animals, let's talk about that. So let's go ahead and highlight all have, geographical, all these. So we're talking about similarities that is being shared. So we call that homology. And remember, homology indicate common ancestry. Now, we're not thinking about ecosystem interaction between individuals. So we can take out ecosystems. We can also take out the word herbivore. That has to do with eating plants, right? We're not really talking about eating. We're talking about homology, similarities. So we can be thinking about anatomical homology, molecular homology, or developmental homology. Nothing having to do with what we eat. We also know that these are kind of different, right? A camel is different from a llama. And because just because they live in a similar area doesn't mean that they could have exchanged DNA, that they could have mated or reproduced. That's not necessarily something we can infer. But the fact that they all have these similar bones, 2 toes, no hooves, true canine teeth, that is indication of anatomical homology, which indicates common ancestry. So H. Let's turn our attention to the 3 organisms again, mushroom, slug, and sea lion. This time, we're not looking at their DNA. We're looking at their amino acid sequence. So SER stands for serine, etc. We know that there are 20 possible amino acid, and we can determine which amino acid is being used by looking at this mRNA codon chart. There's 20 in total. So if you count the number of amino acids, there are 20. But we know that even if an organism is different, they still use the same 20 amino acids to build amino acid sequence. So mushrooms use the same 20, slugs use the same 20 amino acid, and so do sea lions. They all use the same 20 amino acid, even though they might be in different order. Notice how serine is in different order. It's in the first location for mushroom, second position for slug and sea lion. Because amino acid are molecules, the use of the same amino acid in or amino acid sequence is called molecular homology. Now, the more similar two organisms are, the more related they are. So let's see which two is more similar. Both slug and sea lion have tyrosine, serine, and arginine in the same place. Now, the mushroom doesn't have it in those places. So the mushroom is less similar. So that means the slug and the sea lion are more similar because they have more similar amino acids. The less similar they are, the less related they are. So if we look at the mushroom and the slug, these are less related because they don't really have many amino acid sequences that are the same. So they're less similar, meaning they're less related. Let's do more practice. Underline the question. Which organism is the least related to the other 3 organisms? And we know we're talking about relatedness, and we're looking at the amino acid sequence. So let's look at what's similar. Organisms 1, 3, 4 all have this thing called leucine, a type of amino acid in the second position. But organism 2 doesn't. So it seems like organism 2 is different. So we can say 1, 3, and 4 are similar. So those are out. And number 2 is different. So it's least related. So G is our answer. And we are practicing the fact that the less similar two organisms are, the less similar they are. Another practice, underline the question. Which conclusion about the relatedness of the lizards do these data support? The data is that table. The table shows the number of differences in the cytochrome B protein between different populations. So we're now looking at proteins and how similar organisms are. Let's read this table. So we can look at G. atlantica and G. stellini. So let's look at how many similarities they have. If we go over here to G. atlantica and G. stellini, we see they have 36 differences. Again, the number in the table show differences. So we can see that they have 36 differences. Now let's look at B, G. simonii and G. bravoana. So let's go over to the left to find G. simonii, and let's go over to the right to see where we find G. bravoana. So over here, you see where they meet. They have 4 differences. That's not very many differences. Now, are they the most closely related? It seems like they have very few differences. So if they have few differences, means they're more similar. They might be more related. Now, let's look at G. galoti, Eisentrauti, and G. galoti palmae. So G. galoti, Eisentrauti is right here, and G. galoti palmae intersects with this one over here. So we see that these 2 species have 8 differences. They have 8 differences. But we know 8 is not the fewest number of differences, right? B had only 4 differences. So if they're not having the fewest number of differences, it means that they're not the most closely related. D, G. galodi isentrouti and G. galodi trouti, sorry, G. galodi, let's find that. So G. galodi and G. galodi isentrouti, they have 6 differences. They're not the least related because we have organisms that have more number of differences, right? So we can take out the word least. So coming back to B, let's check if it's true that these two organisms, actually their species here, if they are really the most closely related. So let's look at the table. Let's look at the lowest number. The lowest number means it's got the fewest difference. Fewest difference means they're the most similar. So indeed, 4 is the lowest number on the table, and it is between G. simonii and G. bravoana. So these two species are the most closely related. Hang in there. There's a lot of practice, I know, and this will really help us understand the concepts in this topic. We're looking at the 3 organisms again. We can put them in a diagram to see how related each of them are from each other. Each line here is called a branch, and there are many different names for this type of diagram. They can be called phylogenetic tree, phylogram, cladogram, dendrogram, and spindle diagram. You just need to know how to read them. You don't necessarily have to memorize these names. So let's talk about how to read them. If we look at the slug and the sea lion, you can see that in order to walk from the slug to the sea lion, it's not a very far walk. You just go on this path. It's a pretty short walk. So short walks means that they're more related. But if you have to go on a very long walk, for instance, from the slug to the mushroom, that's quite a long walk, right? That's a longer walk. So they are less related. Less related organisms need longer walks to get to each other. Let's practice that concept. Underline the question, which statement is supported by this diagram? Let's look at relationships. We've been talking about relationships in this unit. So we remember that the more related organisms need shorter walks to get to each other. So let's look at A. Hippopotamus are more closely related to cows than javelinas. Let's find hippopotamus right here. Let's see how far we need to walk to get to cows. So let's walk over to cow. Okay, we walked over to cow. Now let's walk from hippopotamus to javelina. Let's go over here. Ooh, that's a much longer walk. So it means hippopotamus is less related to the javelina. But here it says it's more closely related. So it's not accurate. Let's go ahead and take out that piece of trash. Oh, apologies. I'm actually misunderstanding something. Hippopotamus here is actually closer to the cow. So it's a shorter walk to the cow. Compared to that longer walk to the javelina. Let's look at B. Toothed whale. It's over here. Let's see how far it takes to walk over to the deer, to the mouse deer. So we walk. We get to the mouse deer. Okay, now let's see how far it takes to walk over to the hippopotamus. It takes less distance. So it's actually more related to the hippopotamus. Let's see if it says that. It says the whale is actually more related to the deer mouse. The mouse deer. So that's the opposite of what we found. So that's not true. We can take out the word mouse deer. It's not more related to that. Let's look at javelina and pigs. So they are pretty close, right? It's a very short walk. So that means they're very related. Now let's see about baleen whales and toothed whale. Baleen whale and toothed whale. Okay. So it's both pretty short walks, so it's pretty hard to compare. I think these two are probably just as closely related as these two because the walk is about similar in distance. Now let's look at D. Cows and mouse deer. They are pretty close, right? It's not a far walk to get from cow to mouse deer. Now let's look at javelina and pigs. They're also not very far, right? So they're about the same distance. That means they're about the same amount of related to each other. So they're not more related than the others. So we can take out more close related. And it happens that the first one we tried was actually the correct one. Let's see why that's true just for another moment. Hippopotamus walking over to cows. Okay, it's a little walk, but it's a much longer walk to go to the javelina. So the closer walk means it's closer related to cows. Hippopotamus are more closely related to cows. Perfect. That's our correct answer. Let's underline the question again. Which statement is best supported by the information in this dendrogram? We've highlighted the word relationships because we're talking about relationships, and we remember that more related organisms need shorter walks to get to each other. Now, let's see A. Lesser pandas are over here, and let's see if they're more genetically similar to giant pandas. So let's walk over to giant panda. Okay, that's quite a bit of walking. Now, let's walk from lesser panda to the raccoon. Okay, so lesser panda is more closely related to the raccoon because that was a shorter walk. So let's see if it says that. Lesser pandas are more genetically similar to giant pandas than they are to raccoons. That's not what we said. They're actually more similar to the raccoons. So we can take out the word raccoon. That's not true. Brown bears are over here. It says, B says that brown bears are more genetically similar to giant pandas. So let's walk over to giant panda. Okay. Now let's walk over to sun bear. So from brown bear to sun bear. That's an even shorter walk. So we actually know brown and sun bear, they're more closely related because it's a shorter walk. So brown is actually more similar to the sun bear. So that makes it false. Now let's look at D. The bear species are all more genetically similar to dogs than they are to pandas. So let's look at the bears. The bears actually only need a little bit of walking to get to giant panda, but they need a pretty long walk to go to the dog. So we know the bear is actually more closely related to the panda. So the answer, so that means we can take out D. The bear species are actually more similar to the pandas. So we can take out D over here. Now let's look at C together. We haven't looked at this one. Lesser pandas over here. Let's walk over to raccoons. Okay. Now let's walk over to the giant pandas. That's a bit of a longer walk from lesser panda to giant panda. So we know that these two are less related than these two are. So these two are more similar. Lesser panda and raccoon are more similar because it's a shorter walk. Let's see what C says. Lesser panda are more genetically similar to raccoons. Yep. More similar, more related. That is definitely true. One more practice for this moment. Let's underline the question. We have a question mark. Based on the cladogram, which set of bat species is the least related? So we're thinking about least related. Less related organisms need longer walks to get to each other. Now, let's look at A or F. Tenochirus minor, that is over here. How far do you need to walk to get to Megarops nifanae? So let's go over here. That's a pretty short walk in the scheme of things. So they're probably not the least related. So we can take out the last one. They're not that similar. We can look at G, which is Diocopterus spataceus, that's over here, and Otopteropus cartilagonodus. These are some difficult names. So let's go ahead and find that. That is over here. So let's walk from here to here. Okay, so that's not that long of a walk, but we'll see. Let's see which one has the longest walk. Let's see about Haploniteris fisheri and Tenochirus jagori. So let's find the first one with the H over here, the second one with the P, that's over here. Let's do that walk. Okay, so that's a relatively long walk. Now let's see about J. Sinopterus sphinx, that's over here. and Chironax melanocephalus, that is over here. Okay, so let's do that walk. Okay, so those are both pretty long. So let's go back to H to compare. So this is J walking. Now, give me just one moment. Now let's look at H. Going from here to here. That's a much longer walk. So this is the longest walk out of all 4 options. So that means H is the least related. Remember, less related organisms tend to need longer walks. All right. We can also look at these diagrams to see when new traits appear. So according to this chart, 50 million years ago, cells with nucleus appeared over here in this diagram. If you move up 10 million years ago, these organisms evolved the ability to move. But remember, all 3 of these organisms have a nucleus, right? These are all eukaryotes. Now, we're going to move up even further. About 1 million years ago, some organisms evolved the ability to swim. So you can look at when new traits appear and the time that the traits appeared. We can also understand that when the lines come together between different organisms, that is the common ancestor for all of those branches. So these branches go out to the mushroom, go out to the slug, go out to the sea lion. So over here at this point where they all meet, that's the common ancestor of mushroom, slug, and sea lion. Now let's look at this place where these branches come together. It comes together with the sea lion and the slug. So that is the common ancestor of the slug and sea lion. So there are common ancestors where the branches meet. Where the branches end are what we call descendants. So the mushroom is a descendant, the slug is a descendant, the sea lion is a descendant of their common ancestor all the way over here. So the descendants again are where the branches end. Now let's look at all the traits that these 3 organisms have. They all have nucleus, but we know that the slug can also move. But the slug cannot swim. Let's look at the sea lion. The sea lion has a nucleus, it's a eukaryote, it can move, and it can swim. So we know the common ancestor to the slug and the sea lion have all the traits that has the trait that all descendants have. So both have nucleus, both can move, but the slug can't swim, okay? So the common ancestor of the slug and the sea lion have the nucleus and have the ability to move, but it does not have the ability to swim. Now let's look at all 3 organisms. All 3 organisms have one thing in common. They all have a nucleus in their cell. So that's because they're eukaryotes. So the common ancestor, again, has the trait that all descendants have. So down here, the common ancestor of the mushroom, slug, and sea lion have nucleus. That's all we can say about that common ancestor. So we know the nucleus evolved before, so it's further down before the branches. So the nucleus evolved. So the common ancestors have nucleus. And then the common ancestor of the slug and the sea lion can move because we know both the sea lion and the slug can move. So the common ancestor has that ability. And then only the common ancestor of the, well, actually that's not even a common ancestor at all. Only this last descendant, the sea lion, can swim. All right, so we can actually see if you go back here to the common ancestor of the slug and the sea lion, it can't swim because swimming hasn't evolved yet. It evolved down here or up here. Let's practice. Let's underline the question. All the animals to the right of the hagfish would have the common characteristic of what? So hagfish is over here. Everything to the right is over here. Let's go ahead and make sure we're looking at the right place. So this is what we're looking at. Perch all the way to chimpanzee. to the right of hagfish. Now, we have to find a common ancestor that will help us understand the common characteristic. So we can bring our line all the way back to where they touch, right? So we see that they all touch right here. They don't go past to touch here. So the common ancestor is right here. And we can see that the characteristic beneath all the organisms that you're looking at, so in the pink, below all of this, that is the characteristic that all the organisms have, the jaws. It's not lungs because remember, because it evolved after the common ancestor of perch and the rest of this group diverged, the common ancestor of perch does not have lungs. But the common ancestor of all of these, perch all the way to chimpanzee, does have jaw. So we know fur is all the way down here. Claws or nails, that's down here. No, that means salamander and perch doesn't have claws. Lungs, well, remember, perch doesn't have lungs. Jaws, because jaws evolved before all of these organisms branched off, all of these organisms have jaws. Let's do another one. Based on this cladogram, the ancestral species most likely had, that is the question. We have to answer that sentence. Let's go ahead and highlight this word vertebral column. We've been seeing this word. We also see this word cladogram. So that's the name of this diagram. Now, let's look at the keyword here. We're looking at the ancestral species. So ancestral species of all of these different organisms. So the ancestor is right here, right? That's where the branches all meet, is down here. Now, we know that ancestor has the traits that all descendants have. So this ancestor has a trait that all of them have. So let's got what trait the ancestor have. It has 4 limbs, right? So this common ancestor does not have hair yet. It doesn't have sharp teeth yet. It doesn't have retractable claws. It doesn't have ability to purr because it's right here. And it's only having vertebral column and 4 limbs. So which one is it going to be? We see vertebral column, okay, that checks out. We see hair here, that makes that wrong because hair evolved after that common ancestor split. We also know retractable claws evolved much later. Sharp teeth evolved later after the common ancestor. And the ability to purr is a very new trait. So it's not what the ancestors had. So again, it's A. Now let's look at some horses and their hoof. Down here, you're looking at their foot and the bones in their foot. You can see over here on the left, many 50 million years ago, it had 4 toes. It became 3, and then it became basically 1 toe. So it took a lot of time for that to change. 50 million years, 28 million years, 25, 1.8 million years. And we also see the horse getting bigger. So this is the actual horse, and these are kind of the ancestors of the horse. So let's understand what's going on here. We can learn from their fossils, these dead animals' bones. We can basically know what these extinct animals look like. These don't actually exist today. They're not alive. But by looking at their bones, we can imagine what they look like, and we can have predictions. So here we see that these fossils show gradual, slow change, right? Over so many million years, and it gradually took off 1 toe and then another toe. So it took time, and it happened 1 step at a time. No pun intended. So because horses transitioned from many toes to 1, we call these fossils transitional fossil. You go from 4, 3, kind of 2, and then to 1, right? You're not going directly from 4 to 1. So we're transitioning, we call these transitional fossils. Now let's practice. Underline the question. The data in the diagram is evidence that we have to finish that sentence. Let's highlight the millions of years ago. That kind of tells us something about time. Now we see that this is a change between different organisms over time. And we know that transitional fossils show slow, gradual change. And we're thinking about transitional fossils because look at the years. Million years ago, 40 million years ago, 25 million years ago. This is gradually happening over many millions of years. So that's a slow, gradual change. And we know transitional fossils show slow, gradual change. Now, we know nothing sudden happened. This was slow. We know this probably, we're not sure this has anything to do with embryological development, right? How we grow from one embryo. You can't really see that from the fossil because embryos don't have bones and they cannot be fossilized. So we see that a horse is slowly developing over time, over a long time, based on these transitional fossils. Let's look at this question. It's underlying the question. We are to complete the sentence. When multiple transitional fossils are found in many rock layers, they provide evidence of, let's go ahead and highlight transitional fossils. We've been talking about this word. That's a key word. We know transitional fossils can show slow, gradual change. So we're not really looking at seasons, right? We're really thinking about millions of years. Season occurs within a year. That's a short time. We are really not thinking about what people are eating because they don't really show up in fossils. You can't necessarily, well, DNA is not the most direct evidence of fossils because fossils mostly show anatomical or bone structures. And if things are changing, if organisms are changing slowly, even slowly, that's usually because the environment is changing. So we know J is wrong because of this word, unchanging. So that leaves with a G, which corresponds with our annotation box, right? We know transitional fossils show slow, gradual change. So that's a pretty direct match there. Now let's look at this question, underline the question. It has a question mark. Great, so we know what the question is. And we also see that there's a comparison in size. The scorpions back then are, today's scorpions are much smaller than their extinct ancestors a long time ago. And we're also thinking about fossils. That's a key word, definitely. So we remember that fossils are evidence that can tell us what dead organisms used to look like, right? Even though it might be extinct, their fossils can help us predict what they used to look like. They don't really tell us about the numbers of them by looking at the size of the fossil, right? And we're actually not exactly sure just by looking at the fossils what's causing that. So we don't really know if this change in size is a result of natural selection or something else. And right now we haven't talked about natural selection, so we'll get into that. But for now, just trust me, based on the fossil record, you can't really tell if it's the result of natural selection alone. You need more data. We also see that there's a change in the state of the scorpion, right? So today they are much smaller. A long time ago, they were much bigger. So there's not a one original state, right? There's actually a change in the states. So that leaves us with G. And let's look at that. Scorpions in the fossil record are smaller than their descendants are. Excuse me. Let me take a step back. I think we need to focus on this one giant scorpion. So this giant one lived a long time ago. It was huge, right? But you know what? Let's actually come back to this question. Okay, let's underline this question. So there's a question mark. That is the question. Which discovery would challenge the validity of this cladogram? Now, let's highlight those keywords. Fossils, we're going to talk about fossils. And we remember that fossils are evidence that can inform us what dead organisms used to look like. We are now talking about different organisms. I want to bring your attention to ferns and how the evolution of vascular tissue occurred about 409 million years ago. So it happened here. So everything over here has vasculature. These are vascular plants. So what would challenge the information here? Let's read one by one. So a large aquatic vascular plant about 200 million years ago. Let's find where the large aquatic vascular plants are. So vascular is here. So if you find one that's 2 million years ago, that's like over here. We know that recent, we already have had vascular plants, so that wouldn't challenge anything. Let's look at algae. So an algae is over here, right? Algae is at kind of the root of this phylogenetic tree. And so it's been around for a long time. So if you find that there's an algae that has existed for only 1 million years, so over here, very recent, that can definitely happen, right? Because we know algae has been around for a long time. So if you find one recently, that's fine, right? It's been here for a long time. So we can take out 1 million. If it was longer ago, if it was like 500 million years ago, before the algae appeared, then that would challenge the cladogram. Remember, we're finding information that would challenge this diagram. Let's look at the moss. Mosses are over here. So they occurred, looks like around 400 million years ago. So that means any time later than 400 million years ago, like 280 years ago, it would be expected to be around, right? It's been around for longer than that. So C would not be correct. Let's look at D, a fossil of a fern. So ferns are over here. If you find a fossil of a fern that is older than 425 million years, that would be right here. So that would actually challenge the cladogram, because according to the diagram, the fern hasn't been around for more than 400 years, right? It kind of occurred right here between 400 and 380. So if you find something that's bigger than that, bigger number, which means older than that, that would actually challenge this diagram. So D. We're getting close to the end of this lesson. I know it's a lot of practice. Hang in there. We're looking at charts of how birds become different. So in this case, this one species of bird, orange, becomes very quickly yellow and red. So on the left side, you see that there is not a lot of change during this time, and then very quickly it changed into two colors. It moved outward to the side very abruptly. These are very sharp turns. On the right side, we see the same bird species, orange, but it's gradually moving apart. So we are noticing that's gradually becoming different, gradually changing color. And in fact, if you look at the colors, it goes from slightly pinker, more red, and then truly red. And then here you also see a divergence where it changes to yellow gradually. Over here, it immediately becomes red and immediately becomes yellow. So on the right side, we see that there is change that's slow over time. On the left, this is punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium means you have a moment of stasis and then rapid change. Stasis right here and rapid change, big turns. That is punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is slight difference over a long time. So it's slow change over time. That's gradualism, gradual change. So fossils can actually tell us how quickly evolution happened. And we know both stasis rapid, which is punctuated equilibrium, and slow gradual evolution can happen. Both can happen. Now, let's underline the question here. Question mark is here. Which hypothesis was most challenged by the work of Eldridge and Gould? Well, What's their work? Let's see if we can highlight something. They published a paper that there's a tendency for a species to remain the same, so stasis, until a sudden change. So we should be thinking about punctuated equilibrium. We also see in this answer choice that Darwin thought that development of species is a slow, gradual process. So that's kind of two ideas. And we also think about fossils. So we know from fossils that both punctuated equilibrium, which is stasis and rapid change, can occur, and slow, gradual change can occur. So both can occur. But this was actually a discovery that taught us this lesson, right? So Darwin, for a long time, and the scientific community thought that it's always slow. So when they published that finding, it was kind of a shock, right? It kind of challenged each other, these two ideas. You stay the same and then change quickly, or you slowly change over time. These are kind of two challenging ideas. Now, spontaneous generation is when something like immediately becomes a new species. It's actually kind of compatible, right? We're talking about quick changes. So spontaneous, very, very quick, and sudden change, they're actually kind of compatible. They would actually support, so they wouldn't challenge each other. B, embryological development. When we're thinking about fossils, we can't see anything about embryos, right? Embryos don't have bones, so they cannot become fossilized. Geography. We're actually not looking at where the fossils are, right? We actually don't know where the fossils of tribalites are found, so we can't really talk about geography. Again, geography is about location. So we come back to the idea that slow gradual change is a slightly different idea than no change, stasis, and then rapidly change, right? It's two different ideas, two different speeds of change. So they would challenge each other. So it's D. One more practice on this type of question, underline the question, how can the pattern of change in the fossil record best be explained? So we see that there's a moment of stasis and then rapid change and then stasis. So it was a small fossil and then immediately, kind of overnight, it became really, really big. Do you see that? Okay. So we see a sudden change during rapid change, but during this stasis period, it was really stable. So we have both stable and sudden. Now, hybridized mean two species mating and then reproducing. We actually don't know if there's two species mating, right? Because there are fossils, you can't really tell if they mated from the fossil record. We also know that this is a very quick change, it's a rapid change, so it's not gradual. Lastly, we don't know anything based on what we're given that humans are involved, right? So we don't really know human introduced any species. In fact, those many million years ago, modern day humans might not have been around. So we know based on stasis and rapid change, that stasis rapid change is being shown here because we see stasis, rapid change, stasis. We call that punctuated equilibrium. So that tells us it was stable and then suddenly it changed and then it was stable again. So we have F. Couple more slides, hang in there with us. This is a layer of fossil. So if we start digging up here and dig all the way down here, the bottom layer is the oldest layer. Up here where you started digging, up here where we live, you would find young fossils. So let's get this red line. It looks like below the red line, there's a lot of stuff, but above the red line, there's not a lot of stuff. There's a reduction. There's a decrease in number of fossils. And it's a pretty quick drop, right? Immediately after this line, you get fewer fossils. So that line is actually showing you many different taxa has become extinct kind of very quickly. So sometimes the fossil record can show extinction. To let you know, taxa is groups. Technically it means level of organization, but it just means many different groups of organisms became extinct here. So when one group of organism, one taxon, or when you're talking about multiple groups, taxa, when they go extinct, you have fewer fossils, right? Because they went extinct, they're not making bones anymore, they're dead. So they wouldn't be making more fossils. Let's practice. I think we have 2 more slides. Underline the question, highlight important information. Million years ago, we're thinking about taxa, we're thinking about fossils, we're thinking about a certain period. So this is telling us to look at Jurassic period. Now, what do we remember about taxon and fossils? A group of organisms called taxon, groups of organisms called taxa. Okay, so let's look at taxa. Number of groups is on the y-axis. So let's look at A. Competition for food and shelter among reptile species was very low during the Triassic period. Let's get Triassic over here. So we see the number of taxa actually increased. Okay. So just because it increased, it doesn't actually tell us about necessarily what they ate if they had to compete. We just knew that they increased. There could be many reasons for there to be more taxa. Now, let's look at C. Environmental condition for speciation. Speciation is the process of making new species. So let's look at the Permian period. C says speciation, creation of more species, occurred during Permian. So if it increased, we should see this go up, right? Instead, we see this go down. So we know condition with speciation is not favorable here. And then lastly, let's look at D. Reptiles adapted to terrestrial, so the land, during the Cretaceous over here. They went on land, basically. They adapted to living on land. Well, it actually doesn't really tell us where they lived or where these fossils are found, or if that place was covered in water or was actually land then. So that's kind of information we don't have. So let's look at B. We see a great extinction during the Jurassic period because the number of groups decreased. The number of types of organisms, types of reptiles in this case, decreased. So that huge decrease, very sharp decrease, is an extinction. Let's talk about islands and mainland. So here you have mainland, 2 islands. These arrows are showing you the movement or the migration of species from the mainland to the island. So originally, organisms migrate from the mainland or the continent to the island. Usually that's how organisms move, from the mainland to the island, especially when we're thinking about that first organism to colonize an island, to be that first resident on that new island. So studying the movement of animals or organisms in general is called biogeography. It's the study of where organisms are found and where they come from. Let's practice that. Underline the question. It's got a question mark, so we know it's right here. Highlight some keywords. We're thinking about oldest and youngest of islands, and we're also thinking about location. We're thinking about this one island in particular. So we're thinking about location, we're thinking about geography, so that should be ringing a bell. And we should also be able to recognize that when we're thinking about geography, we're thinking about biogeography, and the fact that organisms usually come from the continent to the island. So if you find an organism in one of these islands, where do you think it came from? Probably the mainland, right? The continent. So let's look at these statements. A, the common ancestor of the lizard first colonized the island of El Hierro. So that island is this one. And we know it's actually not the closest to Africa. So it would probably go to one of the closer islands and then go to the farther one later. So A is probably not right. It's not the first to be colonized. And it's not that island that would be the one to be first colonized. Let's look at B. The ancestors of each species, so we have 3 species over here, came from different continents at different times. Well, if you look at the big map here, well, this is zoomed out, there's only really one continent that's close to the island, and that's Africa, right? So usually comes from the place that's closest to, not for instance, the Americas or Europe, because that's much farther away. So it's not coming from different continents. And look at C, the common ancestor of the lizards, these three types of lizards living on these islands, they probably came from Africa. Okay, so they're saying these taxa came from Africa, which is the continent that they're closest to. Interesting. Let's look at D. The ancestor of each species evolved in Spain, so up here, and were brought to the islands at the same time. So usually, so Spain would be like up here, if we had a bigger map. Usually, we know that organisms move step by step. So we probably move to one island and then another island and then gradually move its way down. So they're probably not brought to the island at the same time. So that leaves us with C. And we can think back to our annotation box. Organism on these islands, their ancestors probably came from the continent. So the common ancestor of the lizards probably came from Africa in this case. That is the end of this lesson. I hope you're able to get a lot of information, and you might need to rewatch parts of this. We went through this information really quick. So I'm glad you have this recording to hopefully be a really useful resource for you. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.